When I saw my husband standing in the doorway of the studio, holding the flash drive in his hand, my heart didn't just sink, it shattered. Not because he found it, but because I had forgotten it there, like a carelessly dropped thought that should have never existed. I tried to smile, to act casual, as if it was just another one of those misplaced items we all leave lying around. But his eyes weren't casual. They were heavy, searching, and unreadable. He didn't ask anything. He didn't need to. I knew that he had already seen what was on it, or at least enough to know there was something I hadn't told him. He placed it slowly on the table, then turned and walked away, like someone who had just found a letter they were never meant to read. My hands trembled as I picked it up, and for a second, I debated throwing it into the fire. Erasing everything. Pretending it had never happened. But I couldn't. Because 3 months ago, I said yes to something that changed everything. And now I need to tell you the truth. The real truth. The kind that doesn't make it into the pretty stories. Before I do, tell me in the comments, have you ever kept a secret so deep you feared it would destroy everything if it ever surfaced? And where are you watching from? Because I'm about to take you back to the moment I stopped being just a wife, and became someone I never thought I'd be. It started the way so many quiet betrayals begin, not with a kiss, or a lie, or even a thought, but with silence. A silence that thickened over the years until it became the wallpaper of our lives. My husband and I weren't unhappy, not in the dramatic sense. We weren't shouting at each other or throwing plates. We were just fine. And that kind of fine is sometimes worse than rage. It leaves you with nothing to fight for, and nowhere to go. I had grown used to being background noise in my own house. My footsteps didn't echo anymore, not in his ears. He'd come home, give me the same half-smile, ask about dinner, sit down with his tablet, and that would be the evening. I can't remember the last time he really looked at me. I mean looked, not just saw a figure walking past, but a person with hunger and history. He used to. There was a time I couldn't walk across a room without feeling his eyes on my back. I used to pretend not to notice, just to let the tension simmer a little longer. But those days had quietly folded into the corners of our photo albums. Then the man, came back. My husband's son from his first marriage. He needed a place to stay temporarily while he figured out his next move. A studio lease had fallen through, and he was in between projects. We had space. It'll just be for a few weeks, my husband said. He'll stay out of the way. I remember the first evening he arrived. He hugged me gently, respectfully, but there was a slowness to the way his hand lingered on my shoulder, like he saw more than just politeness required. He looked at me, really looked. As if he was scanning for something familiar, something beautiful. It startled me. That night, I stood a little longer in front of the mirror before bed. Traced the fine lines that had deepened near my eyes. Pulled back my hair and looked at my profile. I didn't hate what I saw. But it felt like I was watching someone else. A few days later, he knocked on the kitchen door where I was organizing spices and said, "I've been sketching faces, but I keep circling back to yours. Would you ever consider sitting for a portrait?" He said it like he was asking about the weather, but his eyes burned with something else. I laughed at first. Me? At this age? He smiled back, a soft shrug. There's a story in your face. I want to try to capture it. I said no. I didn't even think twice. It felt ridiculous. But that night, I lay awake. His words looped like a forgotten melody. There's a story in your face. I hadn't been anyone's story in years. The next morning, I told him maybe. Just once. Just to see. The studio he set up in the basement had soft light. Diffused, warm. He'd moved some things around, cleared space near the windows. The canvas was already blank and waiting. I sat in the chair he pointed to and adjusted my posture. "Don't pose," he said gently. "Just be." I didn't know how to just be. I'd spent so long being everything else, wife, cook, hostess, planner, invisible support beam, that I'd forgotten how to simply exist without performing. But as he stood behind the easel and began to sketch, I tried. My hands found each other in my lap. My shoulders dropped. I breathed. He didn't say much that first session. Occasionally, he'd hum under his breath or tilt his head, but mostly it was the sound of pencil on canvas. But his attention, it was a kind of touch. I could feel it on my skin, a quiet pressure, and it made me sit taller. When it was over, he nodded. "Same time tomorrow?" I surprised myself when I agreed. The second session was longer. He asked if I'd wear something with texture, something soft and aged. I found an old shawl at the back of my closet. It smelled like cedar. When I walked into the studio with it draped around my shoulders, he paused. "Perfect," he whispered, almost to himself. That day, he asked more questions. Not about logistics or errands, but about me. "What were you like at 25? What did you think life would be like at this age?" I told him stories I hadn't thought about in decades. About the time I danced in the rain in Venice. About the letter I never sent to someone I once loved. He listened, really listened. And when I laughed at myself, he didn't join in mockingly, he smiled like someone witnessing something rare. After he left the studio, I stayed behind. Stood in front of the half-finished sketch. My face looked raw. Exposed. But there was life there. Color. Emotion. Something I hadn't seen in myself in years. That night, my husband asked how my day was. I said it was quiet. The next morning, I picked out a blouse with a lower neckline. Put on a little lipstick. I told myself it was for the light, that color matters in art. But the truth was, I wanted to be seen again. Not remembered. Seen. The third session started in silence. I remember hesitating before walking down the basement stairs, wondering for the briefest moment if I should cancel. But my feet moved anyway, and when I reached the door, it was already slightly ajar. He was adjusting the lighting, pulling the curtains to let just enough daylight filter in through the old, narrow window. The chair was already in place. The canvas from the previous day had been turned around, facing the wall. He greeted me with a soft nod, his voice low and unreadable. "You look different today," he said. I wasn't sure how to respond. I hadn't done anything dramatic. Just a change in earrings, maybe. A new shade of lipstick. But perhaps it wasn't that at all. Perhaps he was sensing something else, something less visible. I sat down and adjusted the shawl over my shoulders without a word. He positioned himself behind the easel again, but something about his movements felt slower, heavier. The pencil hovered for a moment, then lowered. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his tone careful. I nodded. "When you were younger, did you ever want to be something other than what you became?" It caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what he expected, a poetic answer, maybe. But I gave him the truth. "Yes," I said. "I wanted to matter." He said nothing. Just looked at me with a kind of reverence that made my breath hitch. And then, quietly, he started sketching. That day, he moved more than usual, stepping to different angles, circling the chair slowly, as if studying the way light curved around my shoulders, my jaw. I could feel his eyes on me even when I wasn't looking. There was a current in the room, low and steady, and though no words were exchanged for long stretches, it was far from quiet. The space between us was alive with unspoken tension. At one point, He approached to adjust the drape of the shawl, and his fingers brushed my collarbone. Just a fleeting touch, light and unintentional. But my body reacted before my mind could catch up. The air felt charged, suddenly heavier, like a storm waiting at the edge of the sky. I kept my eyes on the floor, willing myself to stay still, to stay composed. But my pulse betrayed me. He stepped back slowly, as if aware of the shift but unsure how to name it. The sketching resumed, but his strokes were quicker now, more urgent. I could hear the charcoal scraping harder against the canvas. My palms felt damp. I stared past the window, into the strip of daylight, pretending it was just another day in a quiet house. But it wasn't. When the session ended, he didn't ask the usual "same time tomorrow?" Instead, he stood by the window, looking out, his posture slightly tense. I gathered my things and hesitated at the door. I felt I should say something, anything, to break the silence that now felt almost dangerous. But I didn't. I left. Later that evening, I made dinner. My husband came home and asked how my day was. I told him it was quiet. He didn't press. He never did. He kissed my cheek absently, commented on the smell of the roast, and disappeared into his office. As I cleared the dishes, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. My eyes lingered on the woman staring back at me, the subtle glow on her cheeks, the tautness in her shoulders. She looked like someone trying to contain something just beneath the surface. That night, I dreamt of color. Deep reds, shadows of blue, the warmth of light on bare skin. I woke up before sunrise, heart pounding, and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Something had shifted. I couldn't pretend otherwise. The next morning, I took longer getting dressed. I chose a blouse that flowed differently when I moved, softer fabric, a subtle hue that I knew complemented my skin. I told myself it was for the portrait, that artists noticed these things. But I knew better. When I entered the studio, he looked up and blinked as if caught off guard. He said nothing, but I saw the tension in his jaw. The air between us was thicker now, filled with unfinished thoughts. The sketch resumed. Today he asked me to tilt my head a little more, to let my hair fall naturally over one shoulder. He adjusted a strand himself, the pad of his finger grazing my temple. I stayed still, but inside I felt unmoored. About halfway through, the silence broke again. He asked if I had ever been in love with someone I wasn't supposed to. The question landed like a stone in water. I looked at him, and he quickly averted his gaze, returning to the sketch. I didn't answer. He didn't ask again. The rest of the session passed in quiet tension. When I stood to leave, our eyes met, not with confrontation, but acknowledgement. Like two people who had wandered too close to a line neither of them had intended to approach. I walked upstairs with measured steps, my heart beating faster than it should. In the hallway, I paused by the mirror and ran my fingers through my hair. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Not as a wife, not as a role. Just as me. That night, I didn't sleep much. The weight of the day pressed into my thoughts, forming questions without answers. Was it wrong to feel alive again? Was it betrayal to crave being noticed? The next morning, I found a small note taped to the studio door. New canvas. New light. Same time? And underneath, a single word, please. I didn't know what scared me more, the invitation, or how much I wanted to say yes. The next morning, I stood in front of my closet longer than usual. The air in the bedroom felt thick and still, as if it, too, was waiting to see what I would choose. I skipped over the soft knits and the shapeless cardigans, reached instead for a linen dress I hadn't worn in years. It had a quiet elegance to it, simple, but intentional. It reminded me of how I used to dress when I wanted to be noticed, long before I forgot that I ever wanted such things. My husband was already gone for the day. I moved through the house slowly, drinking my coffee in silence, taking time to arrange my thoughts, though nothing in me felt settled. There was a tremor in my hands that no amount of deep breathing could steady. I wasn't nervous about being alone with him again, that was no longer the question. What rattled me was the inevitability of what we were both quietly agreeing to, the unspoken understanding that something had shifted between us, and we were letting it continue. The studio door was open when I reached it, just like before. He was adjusting the stool, placing a new canvas, and setting the light from the north-facing window. His movements were deliberate, practiced. He didn't look up right away. When he finally did, he hesitated for half a breath, just long enough for me to see that he'd noticed the dress. He gestured to the seat, and I took my place. We didn't say much at first. He focused on his palette, mixing muted tones with soft precision. I watched his hands more than his face. They moved with a quiet intensity, with care that felt almost reverent. And it occurred to me how different his hands were from my husband's, not because of age or size, but in the way they moved through space. His hands seemed to listen. Today, the position was different. He asked me to turn slightly to the side, to rest my hand on my lap, to let the fabric of the dress fall naturally. The light grazed my shoulder. He tilted the curtain slightly to soften the glare. There was an intimacy in how he arranged the space, not through touch, but through attention. The way someone moves when they care about how you are seen. Time passed differently in that room. It didn't tick. It drifted, almost without sound. The pencil strokes, the quiet shifting of fabric, the occasional creak of the stool beneath me, these were the only reminders that we were moving forward at all. At one point, he stepped back to observe his work and said, not looking at me, "There's something in your expression today." I didn't ask what. I didn't want to define it. But I knew he was right. There was something in me I hadn't named, a feeling that had long gone dormant but now stirred under my skin. Like a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Halfway through the session, he moved closer, adjusting a lock of hair that had fallen over my forehead. His fingers barely touched me, but the closeness, the quiet focus, made my chest tighten. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. His presence was loud without words. The silence between us changed tone after that. It was no longer the silence of strangers or formality. It became something warmer, heavier. A silence of things understood but not spoken. He returned to his easel, but I could feel him glancing up more often now, his gaze lingering a fraction longer each time. The session ended with him setting his pencil down and stepping back again. This time, he asked if I wanted to see. I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to confront what he had seen in me, or what I had allowed him to capture. But I nodded. When he turned the canvas around, I felt something shift in my breath. There I was, and yet not. The lines of my face were familiar, but softened. The weariness was there, yes, but so was something else, presence. Power, even. I looked like someone who had lived through things, and still stood. It was beautiful, and it hurt. Because I didn't know if I had ever looked at myself that way. Or if anyone had, until now. He watched me quietly, waiting for a reaction. I managed to say that it was lovely, but my voice caught at the end. He didn't push. Just nodded, and began tidying his brushes. I stood, smoothing my dress with both hands. There was a tremble in my fingers again, but this time I didn't try to hide it. When I reached the door, I paused. I could feel his eyes on my back. That was the moment. The moment where a choice sat between us, heavy, inevitable. We kissed. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe it was always going to happen, the way a tide pulls you whether you resist or not. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It was soft. Brief. But it was enough to make everything real. When we pulled away, neither of us spoke. There was a stunned silence, as if we were both trying to recalibrate. I turned, left the room, walked up the stairs, and closed the door behind me with a careful hand. Not slamming it. Not rushing. Just closing it. I stood in the hallway, heart pounding, staring at the framed photograph of my husband and me on the side table. It had been taken 5 years ago, at a dinner party. We were both smiling, arms linked, laughing at something the photographer had said. We looked like people who had things figured out. But that photo didn't tell the whole story. It didn't show the slow erosion, the months of quiet disappointment, the years of fading touches and half-hearted attempts at closeness. It didn't show how invisible I had felt. Or how much I needed to feel seen. That evening, I acted normal. I made dinner. Set the table. When my husband came home, we talked about his day. I nodded at all the right moments, laughed at his stories, poured his wine. And yet every movement felt like a performance, like a scene in a play I no longer believed in. As he spoke, I kept replaying the moment in the studio, the closeness, the warmth, the weight of that kiss. It hadn't been about lust or impulse. It had been about recognition. About being chosen. Being noticed. That night, as I lay next to my husband in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the distance between us like an ocean. Not hostile, just vast. A space too wide to reach across without first acknowledging its existence. And I knew, deep in the quietest part of myself, that I had crossed a line. That nothing would be the same now. And that I didn't want it to be. The morning after, the house felt unchanged, but I wasn't. I moved through the familiar rooms like someone walking through a dream they couldn't quite wake from. The kitchen still smelled like old wood and coffee, the light still filtered in through the same window, but everything looked different. Not because anything had shifted outwardly, my husband still left early, the dog across the street still barked at passing cars, the mail still came with useless flyers, but because now I carried something inside me that hadn't been there before. I hadn't planned what I would say to him, to the one in the basement studio, nor had I even thought about avoiding him. But I also didn't rush to find him. Instead, I sat with my coffee in silence, waiting, I suppose, for the day to decide for me. Around mid-morning, I heard soft footsteps overhead. He was home. He was moving. I could feel the shift in energy, even though we hadn't exchanged a single word since what had happened. That single moment, that one decision, had redefined everything. But no one had told us how to act afterward. Eventually, a note appeared on the kitchen counter. His handwriting. Careful. Clean. In the studio, when you're ready. No expectations. Just light. Just light. I read it twice, then tucked the note into the drawer beside the sink, as though I needed to protect it. I stood there for a long while, my fingertips pressed lightly against the counter's edge, trying to remember how to breathe like I used to. When I finally went downstairs, the door was already open again. That had become our unspoken agreement, he would never close it behind him, and I would never knock. He was standing at the far end of the studio, adjusting the curtains, trying to coax the morning sun to behave just right. There was a new canvas on the easel, fresh and untouched. Another chair had been added, this one for him. When he turned, his expression was neither expectant nor anxious. It was simply still. I sat, and he sat across from me. No sketching today. No movement between us. Just silence, and breathing, and a strange kind of knowing. Eventually, he spoke. I think I need to paint you standing. It took me a moment to understand. I didn't respond right away. Then I nodded slowly, unsure if the gesture meant agreement or surrender. He cleared space near the wall. The light hit it at a slight angle, creating a soft shadow, not dramatic, but real. He motioned gently for me to stand where the floor met the light, and I obeyed, more out of curiosity than direction. "Just stand as you are," he said, and something about the way he said it made me realize he didn't mean my posture. So I stood. And I let myself be seen again. He moved slowly around the room, adjusting angles, sketching lines in a new notebook rather than directly on the canvas. He was quiet, but not distant. Focused. Careful. And yet I could feel the question hanging between us: had we gone too far? Or had we simply crossed into something we could no longer deny? He didn't ask about yesterday. And I didn't offer. There was no need to ruin the silence with a dissection of something that couldn't be undone or explained. After a while, he paused. "The exhibition," he said, almost as if to himself. "They asked if I had anything that felt unfinished." I didn't answer. He looked at me and said, "They want to see the portrait." "The one of you." My throat tightened. "And will you show it?" I asked, knowing I probably shouldn't. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet." The conversation ended there, suspended in the air like dust in sunlight. When I left the studio, I didn't go back upstairs immediately. I stood at the base of the stairs, looking at the floorboards. Every step forward felt like a decision. Later, in the kitchen, I heard my husband come in from work. He walked past the room, said hello over his shoulder, and opened the fridge like he always did. I responded in kind, kept my voice steady, kept my hands busy. But I couldn't help noticing the way he looked at me that evening, a little longer than usual, his eyes lingering just enough to stir something that had long gone quiet. We sat down to dinner, and he asked me how the day had gone. I said it was fine, that I had helped downstairs with some lighting for the paintings. "Must be strange, having someone paint you," he said with a hint of amusement. "I can't imagine sitting still that long." I smiled, slicing into the roast. "It's not about sitting still. It's about being still." He raised his eyebrows but didn't push further. He never did. After dinner, he went to his study, and I cleaned up, methodically washing each dish, drying each fork, setting them back in their place like pieces of a quiet life I was still pretending I hadn't unraveled. That night, I lay in bed with my back to him. His breathing was soft and even. I could feel the warmth of his body beside mine, and yet I was miles away. There was no anger in me. No bitterness. Only distance, the kind that grows over years, word by word, glance by glance, until one day you find yourself more familiar with absence than closeness. And now, there was something else, not just distance, but duality. I was beginning to live in two versions of myself. The one who folded laundry, picked up dry cleaning, stirred soup. And the one who stood in soft light and let herself be seen. In the quiet, I thought about the painting. Not the one he had started yesterday, but the one he hadn't yet revealed, the one I suspected was the real portrait. The one that wasn't for galleries or collectors. The one that was only for him. Or for me. Or maybe both. And I wondered what I looked like through his eyes. Not just on canvas, but in stillness. In motion. In that liminal space between what we are and what we wish we could be. Eventually, I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I listened to the sound of the house settling, to the occasional creak of wood and wind against the window. And in the dark, I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding for days. Was I still being seen, or was I being watched? And which one did I want more? The morning came with a gray sky and a strange quiet that settled over the house like a blanket pulled too tightly. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the rain form lines across the glass. Everything outside was blurred, trees melting into pavement, cars losing their edges in the drizzle. It suited my mood, that soft confusion of boundaries. He hadn't left a note today. No open door. No invitation waiting on the kitchen counter. But I knew where he was. I could feel it in the air, like the heaviness before thunder. Still, I didn't move. I stayed at the window until the tea went cold and my fingers were stiff from holding the mug. I wasn't sure what I expected. The kiss had changed things, yes, but it hadn't exploded anything. It had just redirected the current. Now we were both drifting in new directions, waiting to see where the tide would pull next. It was nearly noon when I finally walked downstairs. The studio door was closed this time, but not locked. I hesitated, one hand on the knob, the other resting against my chest, as if to calm something inside me. Then I turned the handle and stepped in. He looked up from the canvas, startled but not surprised. His eyes searched my face like he was trying to read something written in invisible ink. I didn't speak. I just walked to the center of the room and stopped, waiting. He didn't ask me to sit. He didn't reach for his brushes. Instead, he moved to the table in the corner and picked up a small, black box. A camera. Not a professional one, something simple, discreet. He held it up slightly, then lowered it. "I've been documenting the process," he said. "Angles, gestures, the way you shift between moments. It helps me remember what I miss." I didn't ask how long he'd been doing it. I didn't need to. There was nothing secretive in his tone. Just clarity. He placed the camera on the table again and turned back to the easel. I saw that the canvas was already half filled. Not with me seated, not the familiar profile or softened pose, but me standing, hands at my sides, head slightly tilted, just as I had stood a few days ago. But something in the painting caught me off guard. He had painted me mid-breath, as if I were on the verge of saying something important. My mouth was almost open. My eyes, half-shadowed, held something between courage and regret. It was uncomfortable to look at, not because it was unflattering, but because it was true. I stepped closer, slowly, my eyes not leaving the canvas. "You painted me waiting," I said finally, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded without turning. "Because you are." I let the words settle in the space between us. There was no challenge in them. No accusation. Just observation. The rest of the session was quiet. He painted, I stood, and the storm outside grew heavier. Thunder rumbled distantly, but inside, the air remained still. I thought of all the things I could have said. Things about guilt, about uncertainty, about the lines we'd crossed. But none of them came. Not yet. Instead, I watched him work, and something in me softened. At one point, he stepped back and wiped his hands with a cloth. He didn't speak right away. Then he said, "Do you know what I notice most when I paint you?" I waited. "It's the way you hold your breath, like you're afraid of being fully here." I looked at the floor. Not out of shame, but because he was right. I had been holding my breath for a long time, not just here in the studio, but everywhere. In the kitchen. In bed. In my marriage. I had become so accustomed to shrinking myself into corners, to waiting for moments to pass instead of stepping into them. And now, this? This was the first time I had dared to stand in my own silence. I turned toward him then, slowly, deliberately. There was a weight to the air between us, something fragile but charged. I took one step forward. Then another. We kissed. It was brief, careful, restrained. A moment suspended in its own honesty. When it ended, we both looked away, not because we were ashamed, but because the moment had spoken enough. Afterward, he returned to his brushes. I stood in the window light, letting the silence stretch, letting the painting continue. That afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and saw my husband sitting at the table, sorting through some paperwork. He looked up, offered a tired smile, and gestured to the empty seat across from him. I sat. We talked about the bills. The roof repairs. The neighbor's dog. Everything ordinary. Everything safe. But my mind drifted to the studio, to the painting, to the unspoken words still hanging in the air. Later that night, I found myself alone in the living room. The rain had stopped. The window pane was fogged from the warmth inside. I traced a line through the condensation, watching it streak downward. I wondered what he was doing in the studio. If he was still painting. If he had picked up the camera again. I didn't feel fear. Not exactly. What I felt was harder to name. Like standing on the edge of something vast, knowing you could step back at any moment, but also knowing that a part of you already had one foot over the line. Upstairs, I changed into my nightgown and slid into bed beside my husband. He turned toward me slightly in his sleep, murmured something unintelligible, then stilled again. I studied his face for a moment, the lines etched deep from years of responsibility, of holding too much without complaint. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't absent. He was just no longer looking. And I was tired of being unseen. I turned onto my back, eyes open, watching the shadows on the ceiling shift as cars passed by outside. Somewhere below, in the dark studio, a canvas sat drying. A version of me, standing mid-breath, waiting. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew I couldn't go back to being a silhouette in my own life. Not now. Not after being painted into the light. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The bedroom was still cloaked in that pale blue haze of dawn, when everything feels suspended between night and day. My husband lay beside me, breathing deeply, one arm thrown across his chest, his face relaxed in sleep. I studied the lines on his forehead, softened now in rest, and tried to remember the last time I had traced them with my fingers. Slipping quietly from the bed, I wrapped a robe around myself and made my way down the hall. I wasn't heading anywhere in particular, just moving, trying to find a place where my thoughts might make sense. I ended up in the living room, sitting in the old armchair that creaked slightly when I leaned back. The silence felt like a presence of its own. Familiar. Patient. The events of the day before hovered in my mind like steam over a cooling cup of tea. Nothing dramatic had happened, and yet it had been one of the most pivotal days of my life. The second kiss. The second choice. There was no excuse I could make, not even to myself. No justification wrapped in longing or miscommunication. I had stepped over a line, not because I was forced, not because I was lost, but because something in me had simply chosen to do so. I spent the morning in stillness. No music. No movement. Just me and the weight of everything I had done and not said. By the time the rest of the house stirred, I had already made breakfast, cleared the counter, and washed the dishes. I moved mechanically, like someone going through rehearsed motions. I didn't feel guilt. Not yet. What I felt was a splitting. Like I was becoming two women. That afternoon, the house emptied. My husband had errands in town and said he'd be gone until evening. He kissed my cheek before leaving, as always, and I felt a flicker of shame, not because of what I had done, but because I didn't flinch. Once he was gone, the silence grew louder. I waited, but I didn't know for what. The hours passed slowly, like a faucet dripping rhythmically into a steel sink. Eventually, I found myself back at the door of the studio. This time, I knocked. I don't know why. Maybe it was an attempt to reclaim a sense of boundaries, or maybe it was a way of announcing that something had changed. He opened the door, expression unreadable. He stepped aside wordlessly and let me in. The room was bathed in warm light. Afternoon sun pooled across the floor and caught the edges of canvases and glass jars filled with brushes. The portrait was still there, the one of me mid-breath. He hadn't added anything to it since yesterday. I was grateful. It felt like the right place to pause. We didn't speak. He walked to the far end of the studio and picked up a small cloth, wiping down his work table. I stood near the window, fingers loosely clasped. Everything felt fragile, like a pause that couldn't last much longer. Then he broke the silence, his voice low. I've been asked to submit work to a new gallery. They're looking for pieces that explore boundaries. The word sat heavily in the air. Boundaries. That was the heart of it, wasn't it? He continued, they asked if I had anything that felt unresolved. I turned to him, searching his face. And do you? He looked at me. Yes. That single word landed between us like a stone in still water. He gestured toward a small side table near the corner, where a flash drive lay beside a notebook. I've been compiling the references. Still images. Poses. Sketches. Not to exhibit. Just to remember. I walked over slowly, letting my fingers brush the cover of the notebook. Inside were pages filled with impressions of me. Not finished drawings, not refined portraits, just moments. The way I stood with one foot slightly turned, the tilt of my chin when I was thinking, the way my hands curled when I was at rest. They weren't romantic. They weren't dramatic. But they were intimate in a way that made my breath catch. I closed the notebook and looked at him. He was standing perfectly still, waiting for something. Maybe for me to react. Maybe for me to run. I did neither. Instead, I said, you should keep them. But don't add more. He nodded, the faintest movement. We sat then, in the quiet. Not close. Not distant. Just there. The studio no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a crossroads. A place that had held truth, and now required decisions. Before I left, I turned to him and said, I need time. He nodded again. I know. Upstairs, I walked straight into the kitchen and opened the cabinet where we kept the tech odds and ends, old chargers, extra batteries, USB sticks. I pulled out a small plastic box, placed the flash drive inside, and shut it gently. Then I pushed it to the back of the drawer. That evening, my husband returned with groceries and a small bouquet of white tulips. He set them on the counter with a quiet smile. Thought these might brighten the kitchen, he said. I nodded, placing them in water, trimming the stems a little too precisely. I watched the petals unfold, pure and delicate, unaware of anything but the light. We ate dinner together, speaking of nothing in particular. The news. The neighbor's fence. The price of olive oil. And beneath it all, the quiet hum of my second life, the one I was now trying to silence before it became too loud to ignore. That night, I sat alone in the bedroom while he showered. I turned on a small lamp and pulled out a notebook of my own. Blank pages. I stared at them for a long time before writing anything. When I finally picked up the pen, the first line I wrote was not about him, or the painting, or the kiss. It was about me. I don't want to disappear again. That was the truth beneath all of it. More than guilt, more than confusion, more than shame, there was this primal ache to be known. Fully. Deeply. Not for what I did, but for who I was when no one was watching. I closed the notebook and slipped it into the drawer beside my bed. Then I turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the sound of water running behind the bathroom door. The rhythm of a life continuing. And still, somewhere deep inside me, the silence pulsed. Not louder. Just steadier. And I knew, the next choice I made would be the one that changed everything. The invitation came unexpectedly. My husband stood in the kitchen with his phone in hand and a hopeful look on his face. There's an open house event at the museum next weekend. They're previewing a new exhibit on domestic still life. I thought it might be nice. Just us. His voice held something between nostalgia and effort, the kind of suggestion made not out of habit, but because he sensed the growing space between us. I nodded before he could read my hesitation. Yes, I said, folding a dish towel slowly, that would be nice. The next few days moved with strange symmetry. We returned to routines, conversations centered around groceries and weather and work. But under it all, a different current moved, one that neither of us acknowledged aloud, but both seemed to sense. He came home a little earlier, lingered at the dinner table a little longer. And I, in turn, responded. Not out of guilt. Not even out of obligation. But because some part of me wanted to honor what we still had, even as another part of me mourned what was already fading. I hadn't gone back to the studio. Not since that afternoon when I asked him not to add more. I'd walked past the door, paused once or twice, but kept moving. I needed the distance. I needed clarity. And yet clarity did not come. Only time passed. It was the night before the museum event when I found myself standing in the guest room, the one we rarely used. The closet in there held a few dresses I hadn't worn in years. Some too formal, some too bold. One of them, though, caught my eye, a midnight blue dress with a square neckline and clean lines, modest but elegant. I held it against me in the mirror, trying to decide whether I still belonged in it. I didn't notice him enter until I caught his reflection behind mine. He stood in the doorway, not saying anything at first. Then he spoke softly. "You look beautiful in that." I turned, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. He crossed the room, gently adjusted one sleeve on my shoulder, and smiled. "It suits you." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, watching the ceiling fan move in slow circles, trying to organize the thoughts that had tangled over the past weeks. There were no clear lines anymore. No safe places to stand. Every choice now seemed to affect someone, him, the one downstairs, myself. And in the center of it all was something I hadn't expected, the realization that I didn't know how to return to who I had been before. That woman was gone. And whoever I was becoming still felt unfinished. The next day arrived with bright skies and cool air. The museum was busy, but not crowded. My husband held the door open for me, and I stepped into the cool, echoing halls, the scent of stone and polish surrounding us. We walked slowly, stopping at paintings and installations, reading the plaques, sharing small observations. There was a quiet between us that didn't feel empty. It was the kind of silence that once would have been comfortable, the kind that needed no filling. But now, I noticed it. I counted its length. I measured its weight. At one point, we stood in front of a photograph, a black and white still of a woman in a kitchen, her back turned, her hands resting on the counter. She wasn't doing anything, just standing, surrounded by quiet evidence of life, a teacup, a towel, a pair of shoes near the door. "She reminds me of you," my husband said, almost absently. I looked at the photo again. "How so?" "She looks like she's in the middle of something invisible. Something only she knows." I didn't answer. But I felt my chest tighten. When we left the museum, he suggested dinner. We found a small place nearby, quiet, dimly lit, the kind of restaurant where the servers speak in low voices and the tables are spaced far enough apart for privacy. Over bread and wine, we talked about everything but the truth. And yet, something in his demeanor had changed. He seemed more present, more open, as if he, too, had been shaken into awareness. At one point, he reached across the table and took my hand. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "that maybe we've both been missing each other for a long time." I looked at him, unsure of how to respond. He squeezed my hand gently. "I want to try harder. To pay attention. If you'll let me." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I nodded slowly. "Okay." We didn't speak much after that, but the silence between us no longer felt entirely hollow. That night, back home, I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair slowly. The room was quiet, my husband already asleep. I caught my reflection and studied it. Not the lines, not the features, but the eyes. They looked divided. Not in conflict, but in transition. A woman in motion. And then, without fully deciding to, I went downstairs. The light under the studio door was on. I knocked once. He opened it without surprise. We stood in silence, the air between us dense with everything we had not said. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said finally. "I almost didn't." He looked at me, and I saw something shift in his posture. Less expectation. More vulnerability. "I won't ask you to explain," he said. "I just needed to see you again." There was no drama in his voice. Just truth. We sat on opposite ends of the room. No canvas between us. No brushes. Just two people trying to understand what had already happened. He stood eventually, walked to the table, and handed me a small sketch. It was rough, unfinished, just a profile, the curve of a shoulder, the suggestion of thought in the posture. "I started this that day you stood in the light," he said. "I didn't know what it was then. I do now." I looked at the sketch, then back at him. "What is it?" He paused. "Someone at the edge of a choice." I didn't answer. I folded the sketch carefully and tucked it into my coat pocket. That night, we didn't speak again. We spent the night together. Not out of passion. Not out of confusion. Out of something else entirely, a moment of clarity, wrapped in stillness. And in the silence that followed, I realized I had crossed a threshold I could never return from. The morning after was not filled with regret. It wasn't romantic either. It was quiet, ordinary, and weighted in a way I hadn't anticipated. I woke up in a space that no longer felt like a secret and yet couldn't be claimed in daylight. He had left the room before I stirred, leaving behind only the faint scent of turpentine and the echo of a night that had shifted something inside me for good. I sat up slowly, adjusting the collar of my shirt, smoothing the hem of my coat as if these small movements could return me to the version of myself I had walked in as. But I knew they couldn't. I was different now. Not ruined, not elevated, just altered. More aware. More responsible. As I stepped out into the hallway, I heard the faint sounds of the house beginning to breathe again. The kitchen faucet. A door closing upstairs. The ticking of the old clock by the staircase. Life continuing in parallel, unaware of what had taken place beneath it. My husband was sitting at the kitchen table when I came in. He looked up, his eyes soft but observant, and offered a faint smile. I returned it, measured and careful. I couldn't tell what he saw when he looked at me. I wondered if something in my posture had changed, if my silence had gained a different texture. But he said nothing. Just sipped his coffee and pushed a plate of toast toward me. The day unfolded in its usual pattern. Laundry, errands, idle conversation. He asked if I'd mind calling the plumber about the leak in the upstairs sink. I agreed. We discussed the idea of repainting the hallway. I nodded at all the right moments. From the outside, we looked like any couple navigating the comfortable rituals of a long marriage. But I noticed things. The way his eyes lingered a beat too long. The way he reached for his phone and then set it down without looking. The way he asked twice whether I was all right, though the second time was masked behind a question about sleep. In the afternoon, I found myself alone in the living room, folding towels that didn't need folding just for something to do. The weight of the morning settled into my chest in a new way. Not heavy, exactly, but pressing. I thought about the studio. About the notebook tucked into the drawer by my bed. About the sketch I still hadn't looked at again. I hadn't planned to speak to him, not my husband, but the one in the studio, not yet. I needed space, and he seemed to understand that. There were no messages. No notes. No knocks at the door. The silence between us was no longer anticipation, but a kind of waiting. We both knew something would have to happen next. Neither of us knew what. Late that afternoon, my husband left to visit his sister. She asked for help with the new bookshelf, he said, grabbing his keys. I'll probably be back late. He kissed my cheek, the gesture automatic, familiar. But then he paused. His hand rested on my shoulder a moment longer than necessary, and I felt his gaze study me again. I met his eyes but said nothing. When he left, the house felt quieter than before. I didn't go to the studio. Not right away. Instead, I walked into the bedroom and opened the drawer where the flash drive still sat inside the plastic box. I hadn't touched it in days. Hadn't even let myself consider what it contained, the sessions, the fragments, the visual memories that shouldn't have existed. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and then placed it into the pocket of my cardigan. The rest of the evening moved like molasses. I made tea, paced from room to room, stood at the window watching the street lamps flicker on one by one. My reflection in the glass looked calm. Composed. But inside, I was unraveling in slow, deliberate threads. When the doorbell rang just after 8, I froze. My heart kicked once, loud and sharp. I walked to the door, not knowing who I expected. But it wasn't him. It was a delivery, a small brown envelope, no return label, addressed only with my name in neat handwriting. No signature. No note. I opened it carefully, and inside was a single photograph. A print. Black and white. It was me standing in profile, backlit by the window of the studio, head tilted slightly down. My hands clasped in front of me. It was a quiet image, almost static, but the emotion it captured was unmistakable. It wasn't a seductive portrait. It wasn't romantic or posed. It was real. I looked alone. Not lonely, but singular. Someone choosing stillness in a world that moved too fast. I stared at it for a long time. When I finally returned to the bedroom, I placed the photo face down on the nightstand. The flash drive was still in my pocket. I pulled it out and set it beside the photograph. Two objects, side by side, one filled with too much, the other with just enough. Sleep didn't come easily. My husband returned after 10, tired and quiet. He changed in the bathroom and slid into bed beside me without speaking. I heard his breathing slow, then deepen. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the photograph in my mind. It occurred to me then that I had begun to live in fragments, small moments of clarity scattered between long stretches of pretense. There was no single truth anymore. Only pieces. Glimpses. And now, I was standing at the edge of them, wondering what would happen if I pulled them all into one place. Before I closed my eyes, I whispered a promise into the dark. No more waiting. No more avoiding. Tomorrow, I would choose. Fully. Completely. And whatever came next, I would not hide from it. Morning arrived slowly, the light dull and diffused through a thick blanket of clouds. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched tea. The photograph lay in the drawer beside me, the flash drive still in the nightstand where I had left it. The promise I had made to myself the night before echoed in my head like a quiet drumbeat. Today, I would choose. But choosing was not a single act. It was a series of movements, of tiny moments stacked on top of one another, and every one of them mattered. My husband was already gone for the day. He had left early, a short note on the fridge letting me know he had a meeting and wouldn't be home until dinner. The note was his usual tone, efficient, warm, but impersonal. I read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the recycling bin without thinking. The house was still. I moved through it deliberately, opening windows, letting the cold air in. I needed to feel something on my skin that wasn't memory. I changed the sheets on the bed, wiped the mirrors, swept the hallway. Every task felt symbolic, like I was preparing the house for something I couldn't name yet. Around noon, I walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, holding the photograph again. It didn't feel like evidence. It felt like a reminder, not of the night, but of the silence that had followed it. Of the space I now occupied, a space between two truths. I looked at the photo for a long time, then placed it face down on the table. I picked up the flash drive next, the plastic cool and smooth against my fingers. I turned it over, then walked to the office where we kept the laptop. I plugged it in without hesitation. The folder opened immediately. Inside were a series of labeled video files, Session 1, Session 2, and so on. Some had dates. Others didn't. I clicked the first one, watched the small window open. There I was, sitting in the chair in the studio, still and focused. I remembered that day, the first time I had really let myself be seen. I fast-forwarded a little. The light shifted. I changed position slightly. There was no audio. Just the subtle movement of time across my body. I opened the next video. And the next. Each one documented a different fragment. A tilt of the head. The way my hands rested on my lap. My expression shifting with thoughts I hadn't voiced aloud. And then I opened one labeled simply reference_alt. It was different. This time, the camera had been positioned at a different angle, farther, a wider frame. I stood by the window. He was in the shot too, off to the side. He approached me slowly, gently adjusting my shoulder. My expression changed. I saw it, the exact moment when the air between us thickened. He stepped back. I turned. And then, we kissed. It wasn't graphic. It wasn't theatrical. But it was real. I paused the video. In the quiet of the room, I listened to the rush of my own breath. My pulse beat in my ears. There it was, the moment. Captured. Framed. Not as a secret, but as a reference. A truth we had let exist without thinking of consequence. I didn't delete the file. Instead, I ejected the drive and walked back to the kitchen. I placed it on the counter and covered it with a napkin, as if hiding it could delay its weight. I knew what I had to do. But I also knew that doing it meant letting something fracture permanently. Later that afternoon, I heard the front door open. My husband was home early. His footsteps moved through the hallway with casual ease, but I noticed a hesitation in the way he entered the room. "Hey," he said, setting his bag down. "Everything all right?" I nodded. "Yes. Just a quiet day." He moved toward the fridge, poured himself a glass of water. Then he paused, looking at the table. "Is that for me?" I turned. He was holding the napkin, now revealing the flash drive beneath it. For a split second, everything stopped. I didn't speak. I didn't reach for it. He looked at it, then back at me. What's on it? I met his eyes. You should see for yourself. He didn't move right away. His fingers tightened slightly around the flash drive. I watched his throat move as he swallowed, watched his mind shift into some place of calculation. He walked to the office and disappeared inside. I remained at the table, unmoving. The ticking of the wall clock suddenly felt too loud. The hum of the refrigerator too sharp. Minutes passed. Then more. When he returned, his face was unreadable. He held the flash drive in his hand, not like something dangerous, just something heavy. He placed it on the table, sat across from me, and said nothing. Neither did I. Finally, he spoke. How long? I hesitated. A few weeks. He nodded once. And what was it? I could have said anything. An accident. A moment of weakness. But I didn't want to insult him with half-truths. It was a search, I said. He looked away. I wasn't looking for someone, I added. I was looking for myself. He stood, pacing a few steps, then turned back. Do you love him? I paused. No. I don't think it was ever about that. He exhaled slowly. So what now? That was the question neither of us could answer. I looked down at the table, at the grain of the wood, the small scratches left from years of meals and conversations and life shared. I don't know, I said honestly. But I can't undo it. And I won't lie about it. He nodded again. Then he picked up the flash drive and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't storm out. He didn't shout. He just walked to the door, paused, and said, I need time. When he was gone, I sat in the silence he left behind. Not the silence of tension. Not of regret. But of consequence. And in that silence, I finally felt what I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks, stillness that belonged only to me. The house was silent in the hours after he left. I didn't move. I didn't clean or cook or call anyone. I just sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faint ring left by his water glass, as if it might give me some clue as to what would come next. There was no storm. No slammed doors. No raised voices or broken plates. But the absence he left behind was louder than any of those things. It echoed in the walls, in the light fixtures, in the air that had shifted with his departure. I wondered where he had gone. I wondered if he had driven far or simply parked around the corner, letting the weight of the truth sink into his shoulders in the quiet. And I wondered, more than anything, whether he would come back. I moved eventually, only because I couldn't bear the stillness of that chair any longer. I walked through each room like a stranger, trailing my fingers along the furniture, the door frames, the memories that lived in the corners. Everything was familiar, and yet I felt disconnected from all of it, as though I had entered someone else's home, someone who had once looked like me and lived like me but no longer existed. In the bedroom, the bed was still unmade. His side of the sheets pushed back, his reading glasses on the nightstand. I stood for a long moment, then straightened the covers slowly, methodically. I didn't want to erase him, but I couldn't sit in the mess either. In the drawer beside the bed, I found the notebook I had started weeks ago. Its pages were still mostly blank, save for that one sentence I had written in the dark. I don't want to disappear again. I traced the words with my finger, then flipped to a clean page and began to write. I didn't write about what happened. Not the studio, not the kisses, not even the night. I wrote about the years that came before. The dinners eaten in silence. The mornings filled with distance. The invisible layers of dust that had settled over us both without either of us noticing until something finally stirred it. I wrote about the ache of being unseen. About the thrill of being recognized. About the cost of both. When I finished, the page was smudged from my hand. My handwriting looked different, more deliberate. I closed the notebook, placed it on the bed, and walked outside. The sky had darkened, clouds pressing low over the street. The breeze was cool and constant, lifting the hem of my sweater as I stood on the porch. Across the road, a neighbor raked leaves into a neat pile. A child rode a bicycle in circles on the sidewalk. Life continued. Life always did. I sat on the steps, watching the street until the light began to fade. The weight in my chest didn't lift, but it stopped pressing down. It just sat there, quietly, like something earned. When I heard the sound of a car engine, I didn't move. I waited. The tires slowed. The door opened and closed. Footsteps approached. He came into view slowly, walking up the path with his hands in his pockets. His shoulders were slightly hunched, not with anger, but with uncertainty. I stood. He stopped a few feet away and looked at me. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Then he exhaled. I thought I'd feel different. After seeing it. After knowing. I waited. But I don't, he said quietly. Or maybe I do. I can't tell what part hurts the most. His voice didn't tremble. It wasn't a plea. It was honest, steady. The voice of someone trying to navigate something that didn't come with a map. I nodded. I know. He looked past me, at the house, at the windows, the lights that still hadn't been turned on. I don't want to hate you, he said. My throat tightened. I don't want you to. He walked past me and sat on the step, letting his hands rest on his knees. I joined him, sitting beside him, not touching. The silence returned, but it felt different this time. Not the heavy kind that suffocated. The kind that listened. I don't know what this means yet, he said. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of it. You don't have to know yet, I said. Neither do I. We sat like that until the sky darkened completely. The porch light flickered on automatically, casting a soft glow around us. Eventually, he stood. I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight. I nodded. Okay. He looked at me one last time. Tomorrow, we talk. I watched him walk inside, heard the soft creak of the stairs as he made his way up. The door closed gently. No slam. No lock. Just a door, closing. I stayed on the porch a little longer, wrapping my arms around myself. The story we had lived, all the quiet years, the fading gestures, the sudden rupture, it wasn't over. But it wasn't the same story anymore. It would never be the same. And maybe that was the point. Maybe what we had now wasn't about rebuilding what broke, but deciding whether something new could grow in the space that had opened. I looked out at the street, then up at the sky. No stars tonight. Just gray. Just stillness. But stillness, I'd learned, wasn't the same as emptiness. Sometimes, it was the space needed before the next breath.